Good morning. I don't know what your plans or your hopes or your ambitions for 2020 were, but I doubt that any of us imagined what a strange and different year this would turn out to be. And still there is so much uncertainty about what the future will look like. It's almost impossible to make any plans with any confidence. For example, just this last Tuesday, the trustees met to make plans about reopening our church buildings. And within minutes of the end of that meeting, I was hearing about these new restrictions, limiting groups to 6. And as I film this, it's still not clear how these new rules will affect churches, if at all. So many people are living with financial uncertainty and job insecurity. People are worried about the roof over their heads. People are anxious about the essential services that they rely on, services that may have to be cut back because of the national debt. Whatever you thought as you looked ahead to 2020, it is unlikely that you expected it to be this different and this uncertain. But one thing that we can be certain of here at CBC is that every September our teaching series returns to the Old Testament as we continue our annual journey through Israel's history. And I know that for some of you this is not your favourite part of the Bible. You'd much rather that we stick to the New Testament all year round. We have come across some passages that are really hard to read, not because they're hard to understand, but because of their content. I recently heard someone saying that the Old Testament is like reading about what God was like before he became a Christian. And it can seem a bit like that at times. And also we read these stories and we wonder, well, how are these remotely relevant to my life today? And so as we return to the Old Testament this term, I know it is challenging, but let's stick with it and let's invite God to speak to us through these ancient stories. We're going to pick up where we left off in December, the beginning of 2 Kings, and we've called this series An Unchanging God in an Ever-Changing World. The book of 2 Kings covers almost 300 years of history. In that time there are 12 kings of Israel in the north, there are 16 kings of Judah in the south. Some of those kings were better than others and some were just really, really bad. 2 Kings starts a little over 70 years after Israel's high point when David and then Solomon were king. But by the time we get to the end of 2 Kings, both kingdoms are in exile. The people have been taken away in chains. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and it seems like the end of the story. And over these next few weeks, we will be reading some of the individual stories from within this 300 years of history. It was a time of upheaval, a time of change. There's personal tragedy, there's national disaster. There are some bright spots, and then the unthinkable happens. Now, I'm not going to recap the story so far, but if you do want a summary of the story from Genesis chapter 1 through to the end of 2 Kings, then we're experimenting this term with a series of short videos that will sit alongside these main Sunday talks. And we're calling this series Taking It Further. There may not be an episode every week, but when there are things that we think will be helpful, we'll add it to the Taking It Further series. And then if you're interested, you can watch the video and take it further. And there'll be a link to these videos on the CBC TV page. When we're reading stories from Israel's history and we're trying to make sense of them and to work out how they apply to us in 2020, it can be helpful to remember that these stories should be read on at least 3 different levels. First, there's kind of the simple story. What's happening? What do the characters do? What do they say? Is this an example to follow? Is this something to avoid? But then these stories are also being told because they help us to understand the unfolding story of Israel's history. At the beginning of 2 Kings, Ahaziah was the new king of Israel, and he was yet another king in a long line of kings who did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so part of the purpose of 2 Kings is to help us to make sense of the exile which is coming at the end of the book, to see that the exile is the consequence of the people's repeated and ongoing rebellion and sin against God. God had promised to be faithful. The people had promised to be faithful to God, and yet time and time again the people went off after false gods, even though God had told them that if you obey me, this will happen. If you disobey me, this will happen. The people knew what was going to happen, but they still made their choice, and judgment was coming. And then on kind of the third level, there is a much bigger story being told, a story that starts before time, it ends after time. It starts at the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, with creation, and it goes on to the new creation that we read about at the end of the Bible in Revelation. And at the heart of this story, there is Jesus and the cross. When we take a step back from the individual stories of 2 Kings, we do see this much bigger story going on. And we discover that behind this bigger story, there is an unchanging God, a God who was there before time began right back in Genesis 1, and a God who's still going to be there at the end of the story after time. A God who is working out his plans and his purposes throughout history. A God who chooses to work with and through his people, even when they seem hell-bent on derailing God's plan every single step of the way. A God who's in control of history, even when it doesn't look like it. A God who is faithful. A God who can be trusted. In the story that we read earlier from 2 Kings, both Elijah and Elisha recognize that they are part of this much bigger story. Elijah had been God's prophet for more than 20 years. He'd done some pretty amazing things, and yet he's ready to hand the baton on to Elisha, who God chose back in 1 Kings 19 to be Elijah's replacement. And since then, Elisha has been Elijah's servant. And whilst the individual stories from Elijah's life are pretty amazing, Elijah has always known that he is part of a bigger story. And so when God tells him that the time is coming to pass on the baton to his successor, he doesn't imagine that he's irreplaceable. Rather, he invests his time into training Elisha. And for Elisha, this must have been a really daunting prospect. These were pretty big shoes to fill. There were some incredible miracles that he would have seen Elijah do, and he must be wondering, how on earth am I going to follow that? And Elijah had had his ups and downs too, and Elisha would have been worried about dealing with the challenges, confronting the king, the difficult times, the persecution, the rejection, and no doubt more than once he wondered whether or not he was ready. But Elisha knows that he is a part of a bigger story, and so he trusts that God will equip him for the task ahead. That's what's going on with this strange request in verse 9. Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. It's not that he wants to be twice as spiritual as Elijah, but in that culture, the eldest son inherited a double portion of his father's estate. And so this request is to do with inheritance and succession. Elisha recognizes that God's Spirit has been on Elijah, enabling him to do and say all the things that he had done. And Elisha knows that he needs the presence of this same Spirit if he's going to be able to pick up where Elijah leaves off. And as the story unfolds, we see that this is what happens. Just as God's Spirit was on Elijah, now God's Spirit is on Elisha. And it's immediately evident as Elisha repeats the miracle that Elijah has just done, dividing the waters of the Jordan, walking across on dry ground. And as he does this, he asks this question: where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah? And this suggests to me that Elisha is stepping out in faith at this point. He knows that God has called him to follow on from Elijah, and he's being obedient, even though he's not totally sure of what is going to happen next. But as he is obedient, God acts. And the company of prophets who are watching they answer, the spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha. However daunted Elisha may be, he knows that without God he can do nothing, but with God's spirit resting on him, he can do all that God is asking of him, no matter how impossible that might seem. We live in a time of incredible uncertainty. 2020 has been a year like no others, and we've all lived through huge changes to our daily lives over recent months. But when we take a step back, we discover that there is a loving and a faithful God who is still working out his plans and his purposes in spite of all that is going on. He is a God who wants us to be involved in what he is doing. As we read through 2 Kings, we will see that God is interested in, and God does care about our individual stories, but he also wants us to lift our eyes out of our individual story and to see that we're also part of a much bigger story. The last 6 months have been a time of incredible and rapid change for the church, locally, nationally, internationally. And I believe that as things start to change again now, we shouldn't just be hoping that everything will go back to how it used to be. The future needs to be different to the past. And change can be difficult and it can be painful, especially when we focus on our individual story. But when we take a step back and see the bigger story, we discover that there is a faithful and a loving God who does not change. And so one of the questions that each of us moving forward should be asking is, what is my part in this new thing? What is it that God is calling me to do? And that may seem scary. It may seem daunting. You may think that you're not ready yet. But God wants us to trust him, to trust that because of his Spirit, he will give us everything that we need. And he wants us to step out in faith. He wants us to stop waiting until we feel ready, but to trust him and get on with it. Our vision talks about being an authentic community of disciples and uses the language of walking, being on a journey. And on this journey, each of us will have Elijahs just ahead of us and Elishas just behind us. The Elijahs just ahead of us are those who we're learning from, those who are getting us ready for the next thing that God has for us. And the Elishas who are just behind us, those are the people that we're investing in, who we're preparing for the next thing that God has for them. And so maybe one of the questions that we will explore this week in our home groups is, who are the Elijahs and who are the Elishas in my life? Both Elijah and Elisha knew that they could only do what God was asking of them because of God's strength and God's presence with them. It was a time of change and uncertainty, but behind it all, there was a God who never changes, a God who loves us, a God who wants us to put our trust and our faith in him.